And to pass the course, all the reviews from this point forward, instead of me just speaking the questions and all that, and having you jot them down, I'll have them printed up ahead of time. So most people did well, but there was a couple things that almost everyone missed, and a couple other things may have been in the translation. So this will be the only time I'm this generous, but because I can't tell how much was me and how much of it wasn't, I added 20 points to everybody's score. So some of you got over 100.
I was confused. I was like, this guy's got crazy beard.
Do not expect it again, because the next one will be printed out and you won't be able to plead ignorance. And then some of it may be just people had a rough week and didn't have time to look at it, because if you think about it, there were 3 questions, one was 2 parts, and then there were 6 or 7 references, I think 7. So if you got the 7 references, you automatically got a 70. So if you put the book down, and most people put the reference down, I think 1 or 2 people had the book but not the reference, so I gave them half credit. Virgin birth, a lot of you had accurate answers, and I thought about giving half credit on some of it, but it was too creative. So that's why I just said, you know what, I'll give everybody 20 points. Because it's not that the answers were wrong, some of them were correct, but some were kind of vague, like fulfill prophecy, which is true, but that's a little generic. But some of you said fulfill prophecy and gave verses for a particular prophecy. So that's why, so I just said, you know, I'll just go across the board, and then I didn't want to punish the people who did well, so, because who knows, they may need the points later, so I just gave it across the board. But the reason I went with the two reasons that we emphasized for the virgin birth were, number 1, because the line of the kings of Israel was cursed, and number 2, because without the virgin birth, Jesus Christ would inherit sin from his Father. So those are the 2 that I emphasized, because I think they're the most important as far as the whole reason for him coming, and they're the 2 we mentioned in class. So that is that. And I'll give Janice hers when she sees, but you know, now Janice gets all worried. She did very well, so you can tell her that. All right, so Old Testament survey. Give me a minute to swap out my notes here. I'm trying to learn to stick to notes again, so that I know what you're supposed to be responsible for. All right, so on our chart here, you know, which I'm going to erase, there are major philosophies of mankind. And the Bible, not surprisingly, is against them. Man's philosophy is pretty much always that man gets better and better as he goes. So we won't bother looking into who said what and which philosopher said what, but basically the three major approaches to the history of mankind in the secular world is he started here in the mud and he just gets better and better. And then you have those that say, well, no, he goes up and down, but in general, he gets better and better. Okay? And then you have those that say, no, he started out down here, was going along, and then he had a jump start in evolution, and he went along here, and he had another jump start, and he has different jump starts, you know. That big one is where the aliens got involved, you know. But the Bible looks at it differently, not surprising. And in the Word of God, mankind started out in a garden without sin, and he fell, and God made a way to let man start over, but it wasn't quite as good as it was when he created Adam because of sin. And man kind of did this, and God destroyed the world with a flood. And he starts over, and starts over with Noah. You end up at the Tower of Babel. Starts over with Abram and his descendants, and they're supposed to be these kingdom of priests to. He doesn't call them that yet, but they're supposed to draw them into God, and so that the nations can be blessed through them. And they kind of ignore the Gentiles, except when they're fighting them, and end up in Egypt. So God starts over and gives them a law. And they go down and they end up crucifying their Messiah and rejecting the God of the Bible. And then Jesus Christ makes it possible where spiritually they're right back up here and physically they can be close. And during this age, man goes down and he's going to end in rebellion. And God gets the church out of here with a rapture and judges this world with a tribulation, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And Jesus Christ comes back and sets up his kingdom, and it's good, 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 good. And at the end, man rebels, and God destroys it and starts over the new heaven and new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness. New heavens and new earth, in 2 Peter 3, it's new heavens and new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness. So that righteousness is going to dwell in the heavens, not just the earth, which makes a verse in Deuteronomy make sense, where God gave the constellations, basically, gave the universe, the stars, as an inheritance to the Gentiles. So man will eventually move, and that new heavens and new earth, start out on the earth and populate the universe. And that would seem to have been God's plan from the beginning, but man sinned and God poisoned out the atmospheres of the universe, apparently. He certainly has not allowed us to populate it. But God allows Satan to interrupt his plan. He never allows him to defeat his plans. So that's why in 2 Peter 3:9 you have him saying that righteousness will inhabit the heavens and the earth. Okay? And so back in Genesis 7, we've just come off the flood. We're in the flood. And just to give we'll look at a little bit of a time frame. We know it rained, most people know it rained 40 days and 40 nights. But they were actually on the ark for over a year. That must have been fun. In Genesis 7, the Bible says, "And the Lord said unto Noah, Come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteousness before me in this generation." And if you look at the dimensions of the ark, it's basically shaped like a coffin, which has a lot of typology in it. It has 3 stories in it, just like the universe has 3 heavens. And God does many things by 3s and by 7s. God is a Trinity. He made us as a Trinity, if you will, a tripart, not necessarily a Trinity, because that would be 3 people in one, but a tripart being. We have body, soul, and spirit. Okay? And in chapter 7 it says, "And the Lord said unto Noah, Come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation." So now in this time, generation is talking about horizontal. Okay, it's not the generations, it's not his genealogy. Here it's talking about in this generation that's on the earth. Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by sevens, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean by two, the male and his female. So everybody knows 2 by 2, and that's generally what the Bible talks about, is 2 by 2. But here we see that clean beasts went in by sevens. If you think about what happened when Noah got off the ark, he offered a sacrifice. You don't sacrifice unclean animals, you sacrifice clean animals. I suppose he could have offered 5 of each of the clean. As far as I know, it doesn't say. For whatever my opinion is worth, it makes more sense to me that he wanted 3 pairs of the clean, 1 pair of the unclean, and you offer 1 of each of the clean. But whether that's correct or not, what we do know is there's 7, male and female. And the reason I say that is because they're by sevens, the male and his female. So, seems like you would have 3 pairs and then 1 for the sacrifice. Down in verse 4, you have, for yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So that's where you get that 7-day warning. Okay, he's already built the ark. God has brought in the animals. Noah didn't have to go collect the animals, you know. So when you have the comedians talking about, you know, the hard job he had, you know, 2 mosquitoes, male or female, you know, all that kind of stuff. No, God brought in the animals. Okay, Noah built the ark, and God brought the animals. And he gives them a 7-day warning. He says, get in, because in 7 days I'm going to destroy it, and it's going to rain 40 days and 40 nights. And verse 5, Noah does what he's told. Verse 6, and Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was upon the earth. Verse 7 says it's him, his wife, his sons, and their wives. And you have in verse 11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month. You ever wonder why it says, you know, in the 1st year of the reign of King whoever, you know, all those things are in there. There may be other reasons, but one of the reasons is all those things are in there when God wants you to be able to figure out a time frame. For example, Daniel's 70 weeks. You know, from Nehemiah 2 until Jesus is baptized is 483 years. It's 69 weeks. Well, how do you know that? Well, because you go through all the different times where he says in the first year of this king and the 2nd year of this king and the year that King Uzziah died, and you put them all together as a puzzle and you realize, oh, it's 483 years. And other things like that. Now, in this particular one, it's going to show you how long that they're on the ark. So he's 600 years old. It's the 2nd month and the 17th day of the month. All right. Then it says the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. As we mentioned before, whenever the windows of heaven show up or a door in heaven, it's always from the 3rd heaven. God's opening up that great deep that separates this universe from the 3rd heaven, and for something to go in or for something to come out. In Malachi 3, God talks about pouring out blessings on Israel if they would keep their tithes and give their tithes and offerings. And what did he say? He said he'd open the windows of heaven to pour out blessings. So from they're coming from God's abode. So these waters came from the great deep, the windows of heaven. So God sent water through the universe. So there's more water on earth afterwards than before. Now the fountains of the great deep could also be that breaking up there, that water coming down, but a portion of the great deep, by comparison, a little drop of the bucket is the seas here on earth. You have fountains under there, and spring fountains in the Bible is typically a spring. So you can have those water coming up from underneath as well. Okay, Ended there 40 days, 40 nights. And verse 16 says, and they went in male, and they that went in male and female of all flesh, as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. We won't turn there. You can jot it down if you like, but Revelation 3:7, God says, I am he that openeth and no man shutteth, and shutteth and no man openeth. So when God shuts the door, nobody's going to open it. So God shut that door on the ark, and time was up. Okay? Then the flood comes, and it says, the waters prevailed, were increased greatly upon the earth in verse 18. And in verse 19, all the high hills were covered. In verse 20, it says 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. So 15 cubits, if this is a standard cubit, for argument's sake, we'll use an 18-inch cubit. Cubit is the elbow to the fingertip. That would be 22 and a half feet. Obviously, you're not covering a lot of mountains with 22 and a half feet. So there's two possibilities. I tend to go with the first one because it makes more sense to me. I think it's, and it could be a little bit of each, 15 cubits above the highest point on the globe. You could say that the earth was mostly flat, but then you have to say a high hill was under 20 feet. So, they can stand there in 22 and a half feet of water if the hill's 20 feet. So that's not exactly a high hill. Plus, all over the world, you find hilltops where predators and prey are all together trying to avoid lava or water. Right? They're trying to avoid something that's rising. So you have, tigers and snakes and chickens and whatever, all gathered together. Why would they do that? Because they're not worried about each other. They're worried about what's rising. What would be rising, either lava or water. And in this case, obviously, predominantly water. And although also I wouldn't be surprised if the mountains are higher than they were before that. If the land was all in one place originally, you start moving those around, and you slam Asia and Europe together, and you have mountains come up in between them and so on. It could be that they're higher, but for it to be 15 cubits, to me the only way that makes sense is if it's 15 cubits above the highest hills. Verse 22, who died? All in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that in the dry land died. All right, verse 23 basically says man and cattle and creeping things and fowl and everything. And the end of verse 23, and Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the earth, and the waters prevailed upon the earth in 150 days. So for 5 months, there's no land showing at all. Okay? For 5 months, all they see is water. It rains for 40 days, 40 nights. For 5 months, all they see is water. And chapter 8, verse 13, and it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. Okay? And in verse 14, and in the second month, on the 7th and 20th day of the month, the earth was dried. Okay? So, and then they go on, and God tells them in verse 15 to leave, verse 15 and 16, and they do. So, from the 600th year, Noah being 600, from the second year and the 17th day, they're there. And then a year later and 10 days later, the 601st year of his life, the second month and the 27th of the month, the earth was dry and God said, go. So basically a year and 10 days they're on that ark. In 5 months of that time, they couldn't even see the tops of hills or anything else. Okay? I suppose they may have had food left over to start their journey, but also you have about 7 months where there's some land that's capable of growing things, because it's now not totally underwater, even though they can't get off yet, okay? So they may have had some things growing during that 7 months, all right? But obviously they also had food that they brought with them. All right, chapter 9 and verse 17. So now you have this new world, and God's going to institute human government on a small scale to give man another opportunity to succeed and to police up his own actions. Now, if you hold your finger there and go to Romans chapter 2, now they didn't have the law back then. So how could God judge them by their conscience? Verse 12 of Romans 2, for as many as have sinned without law shall perish also without law. That's these guys and other people at different times, but it certainly matches the people up to the flood. And as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. So the Jews had the law. One primary reference here is Gentiles without the law and Jews with the law. But it certainly applies to people up until the flood. Verse 13, for not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. Verse 14, here's the key. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these who? These Gentiles, having not the law, are a law unto themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts. So people instinctively know it's wrong to murder. They instinctively know it's wrong to steal. They instinctively know it's wrong to take someone's wife. There are certain things that are God put on man's heart and wrote it there. So the middle of verse 15 says, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts, the meanwhile accusing or excusing one another. Now that goes on even in today in some degree, because it says in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. Okay? So that also applies to people. You say, what happened to people who never heard and things like that. So it applies to various people in different ages, but we're looking at it just for where we are in Genesis. Their conscience either accused or excused them. You know, a lot of times now we use excuse as, oh, he's just making an excuse. But no, here, if you're guilty, your conscience accuses you. And if your conscience is clear, it excuses you. Not as in, oh, I'm just trying to make an excuse, but I'm not guilty here, so it excused me. When I am guilty, it accused me. Okay? And so that's where they were. Well, God's going to add some things here, because obviously it ended, them being judged by their conscience, ended in Genesis 6 with every thought of man, every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually in Genesis 6:5. So in Genesis 9, they get off the ark, and it says, and God blessed Noah and his sons, and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Similar thing, well, basically up to that point, same thing that he told Adam. But then the rest changed a little. Instead of dominion, now it's the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, and upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. Mankind trying to deny God is always at a loss for why animals don't just kill us. They say, well, it's our intellect and weapons and tools. Yeah, but most of the time people are walking around without weapons and tools, especially ones that are capable of killing a lion or a rampaging elephant or a hippo or a tiger or a 40-foot snake. And there are different times in history where civilizations collapse and lose a lot of their technology. They're pretty primitive weapons, and yet animals still fear man. And yet we're easily cut, we're easily hurt, we're easily broken. We're not faster than many things. The only things we're faster than can't hurt us anyway. From a logical standpoint, I mean, we're like a turtle without a shell. I mean, basically, most of the carnivores, any large carnivore is faster than us, stronger than us, has sharper teeth, sharper claws, there's no reason other than God just made it that way where they have the fear of us and dread of us. Sometimes someone will get killed. But when you think about it, I mean, think about all the people, 1 billion people live in India. All the millions of people live in Africa. How many of them are ever killed by lions and tigers? It happens. But comparatively, they don't even bother with us. Okay? And usually, if you're going along and making noise or they smell you, they go the other way. How many people live in the Northwest and there's grizzly bears everywhere? You rarely see anyone killed by a grizzly bear. A couple of years ago, the lady didn't realize it till she drove away. Someone else, I think they were videoing it or whatever, but she goes out in Northern California. She goes to her car that's in the parking lot at the mall. She gets into her car and drives away. And when she drives away, they're laying under her vehicle. I think she had an SUV, so a little height to it. Was a couple 100-pound mountain lion, Didn't even bother with her. Knew she was coming. Do people get attacked? Yeah, on occasion. But it's funny, the more time goes on, the more this world breaks down, the less fear there seems to be. And yet man can't explain that either. Until you get to the tribulation, where what are the 4 main ways people are dying in, I think it's Revelation 6? War, famine, pestilence, and beasts of the earth. So what do people do? They have the books and movies about, Day of the Animals or zoo or whatever. Every 10 years they come out with a new batch of them, but it's, the day, the animals decided enough is enough. It's all Revelation 6, and some other places. But here they have this fear of you and dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, every fowl of the air, and upon everything that moveth upon the earth. All that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea, in your hands are they delivered. Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things. So now they're going to be carnivores. If you think about what was going on, we talked about last week in Genesis 6 in Old Testament, we talked about the sons of God, the angels. In Jude it says the angels that sinned. We put together 1 Peter 3, where Jesus preached the spirits in prison. Men are not spirits. We have spirits, but we're souls. Angels are spirits. He preached the spirits in prison. 2 Peter 2:4, he brought the world of the flood on the world of the ungodly. So people that say the sons of God are the sons of Seth, they were the godly line of Seth. Noah's cousins, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, and all the way back, they all drowned. Okay. Anyone that was still alive drowned. They were ungodly. They were of that line of Seth. And it says the angels that sinned, what were they? Which they were disobedient when in the days of Noah. They did the same thing in Sodom and Gomorrah. So that's why we saw in Jude and in 2 Peter that in the same sentence, the angels that sinned, God spared not the whole world, but spared Noah. They did the same things they did at Sodom and Gomorrah. What did they do? Going after strange flesh and committing fornication. So, so giants in the world in those days and all that. So, just a separate thought. We don't have time to go through the study, but just a thought to throw out there for your own study. If you'll notice throughout the Bible, there's a relationship between our interfering in the spirit world in ways that God doesn't want and vegetarianism. Not that everyone is vegetarian is, in the occult. I'm not saying that. But God limits starts limiting man's interaction with these supernatural beings, what does he do? Starts letting you eat meat. Now the Jews could only eat clean meat because they wanted to limit it more and make them a peculiar people and some other things, make them holy and all that. In Timothy, what does it say? The seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, what are they? Forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from meats. Now I know meat sometimes in the Bible is food, but nobody's, in the context, it's talking about flesh, because nobody commands you to, there's not many people deceiving people by saying don't eat food anymore, okay? Speaking lies and hypocrisy. So, what do you see in Eastern mysticism, and Eastern occults and all that? A lot of vegan, vegetarianism. In the severe satanic rituals, you also have eating blood and sacrifice like that. But when you don't have it that severe, what do you have? And what do all the Tibetan monks and all those people say? When eating flesh clouds their ability to communicate with the spirit world and with the universe. Okay? All those things, a lot of things that kind of go through there. But I just throw that out there. There's actually, it's not, there's not enough scripture to say, yep, there it is, that I know of. But there's a correspondence goes throughout scripture. So like a lot of things here, it's a survey course, but I'll just throw that out there for you to notice whether it's true or not in your own study. But he's going to give flesh, but he says don't eat the blood. Verse 4, but flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat. The blood here is forbidden. The blood's forbidden under the law in Leviticus 17:11 and other places. And even in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, in Acts 15, when they're trying to sort out what kind of burdens should we put on the Gentiles and what should we leave off them, they say there's just a couple things don't do. And one of them is not to eat blood. So what does every society do? Man is always anti-God without even knowing it. Several cultures, German and several others, what do? They have blood sausage. They purposely eat blood and have almost raw meat. And people say, well, that's just my culture. Yeah, your culture is anti-God, just like everybody else's, I know it's in your culture. Where did it come from, though? Your culture used to be wearing wolf skin and praying to trees and stuff, too. Okay? That doesn't mean it's okay, all right? So God says you don't eat the blood. And so he institutes capital punishment. And this is different. Remember, under conscience, God's going to hold them accountable, judge them according to their conscience, and murder's wrong. But when Cain killed Abel, God put a mark on him and said nobody kills him. So there's no capital punishment before the flood. It's specifically forbidden. But from this point on, you have capital punishment. Okay? Verse 5, and surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it, and at the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require life. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. Okay? So, verse 9, he says, and I, behold, I establish my covenant with you, and with your seed after you, and with every living creature that is with you, of the fowl of the cattle, and of every beast of the earth with you, from all that go out of the ark to every beast of the earth. Even the idea of not living as long, probably everyone here, certainly most people, kind of have wished that sometime we could live to be 900 and some years old. Some people are like, no, I don't want to spend that long here. I want to go to heaven. That's great. I've had those spiritual moments too. Maybe you're more spiritual than I have, and they're a lot longer. But from I just think it would be cool to live 950 years, especially since they seem to be full of strength until right toward the end, just like they are today. But on the other hand, that seems to be a mercy, because the longer men live, the more they seem to become evil, and more all about themselves. And perhaps that's one of several reasons why man was able to become so evil so quickly. I know the sons of God being around. I know there's other things. But, have you ever noticed, when people get to be 70, 80, 90 years old, they'll say, they don't care. They'll say whatever they want to say, and they don't care what you think, you know. And maybe if they're living to be 900, maybe it'd take them a little longer to not care. But you know, man, man just tends to go that way. You know, there's more time to invent things. You know, how about the Christian walk? It's supposed to be the longer you're saved, the closer you grow to the Lord, and it can be, but there's certainly plenty of examples where you just kind of, you go down, down, and down. Not that and you don't have to be, and that's not God's plan, but it happens a lot of times. You know, people were serving God for 20 years, and for the next 10 years, you don't find them anywhere. So I don't know. It's possibly God's mercy that made us live a tenth of the length of the time. But regardless of the reason, that's what happens. The years that each generation now tends to get shorter and shorter very quickly, so that about 500 years later, by the time you get to Abraham, you know, they're living about 100, 120, 130 years. You know, they're still a little better than we are. I think Jacob was like 77 when he got married. Isaac was 40. You know, I get it. But, you know, by the time you get to David, it's about like us, okay? And so you have this new covenant that God's making. And verse 11, he says, I will establish my covenant with you. Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood. Neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. Now, there's a lot of reasons why we know the earth was not a local flood. The flood was not local. People want to, you know, try to make the Bible, you know, they kind of feel silly, believe in the Bible, so they try to make it more palatable to the modern world. So they just talk about local floods. Well, if it's a local flood, then Noah was stupid, because why build this thing's about the size of an aircraft carrier. It's 300 cubits long. You know, that's what, 450 feet if it's 18 inches? Why would you go out there and build? I mean, how long does it take to build this thing? Went out there and, you know, people say they didn't have power tools. I don't know what they had. They may have had power tools, you know. I don't know what they had, but I know he built an aircraft carrier, essentially. It'd be easier and quicker just to move, you know. Fly to Florida for a year, you know. Wait for the floods to dry up, you know. But another thing is, it makes God a liar. God said he wasn't going to destroy man with a flood anymore. Well, men have been destroyed many times by local floods. But here he says he's never going to do it again. Verse 12, and God said, this is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. Now you have people say, see that, the Bible, that's another error in the Bible. The Bible's full of errors. There's many clouds up there without a rainbow. Only once in a while do you see a rainbow. And then we learn to fly. And then you figure out, no, all clouds have rainbows. They're visible from the top. Only occasionally is it visible from the bottom. But from the top, they're visible. Certain angles, they're visible. You say, well, why would that matter? Because the reminder's for God, not for us. Now, for us, it's a nice reminder, but that's not what it says. Verse 15, and I, who's talking? God, I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. So that bow, every time God looks down, he sees that rainbow, and he says, oh, yep, I promised him I wouldn't do it. He probably, I don't know, I guess I can't say he regretted it. Well, he regretted making man in the first place for a while. But he puts that bow, makes a covenant that he isn't going to destroy the earth. All right, so shortly after that, we're going to get to our current state. Okay, our current world. In Genesis 10, you have the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. If you follow these out, or if you follow genealogy of nations backwards, Hamites basically are Africans. Okay, they're descended from Ham. Caucasian people, white people, whatever, are from Japheth. And Asians are from Shem. That's why you have Semitic. If you're anti-Jewish, you have the word anti-Semitic. It's anti-Shemitic. Now, American Indians are Shemitic. Chinese are Shemitic. There's a lot of Shemitic peoples. Because of the Jews and anti-Semitism, it's kind of become in modern times associated with Israel, with Jews only. But really, any kind of Asian at all comes from Shem. Now, I realize there are mixtures. A couple of us were talking about this before class. In Africa, the further north you go, the lighter skin they are. In Asia Minor, you got Japan way in the Far East, and you go all the way over to the Middle East, they don't look the same. The closer you get to Jerusalem is in the center of the earth geographically. It's got Europe here, Asia here, Africa here. It's the center of the world. And the closer the Shemitic people get to there, the more they look like the people in North Africa. Down in South Africa, they're mostly very black or dark brown. But the closer they get to Jerusalem, the further north, you look at Libya and Egypt and all that, they're lighter. You go to Europe, you go to Northern Europe, you have Germany and England and Bavaria, but the closer you get to Southern and Southeastern Europe, you have darker skinned, more olive skinned Caucasians. You have Italians and so on, okay, and Greeks and so on. So why? Because over the thousands of years, there's more mixture there. I mean, there's 200 countries roughly now. So people are mixed all up, but the closer they are, the further they are from that center, the more distinct they still look, okay? And so during this, here's how they're divided up. And you have a guy in verse 8, and Cush. Cush is one of Ham's sons. I think he had 4 sons. One of his sons, Mizraim, is the old name for Egypt. In fact, I think Egypt still calls himself Mizraim. Cush is Ethiopia, and then you have a couple others. Canaan and Put. I think Put is Libya, if I remember right. Just like Persia, Iran used to be Persia, and the Jordanians used to be the Ammonites and the Moabites, and so on. Okay, the Syrians are still the Syrians. So this guy Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. So this is his kingdom as opposed to God's. And Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And Asher leaves there and goes to Nineveh and builds Nineveh in verse 11. And so you have Babel and you have Nineveh over there in modern Iraq. Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. Babel was for Babylon. And over in chapter 11, we're going to close in just a few minutes. Chapter 11, now it doesn't say that Nimrod is still the king over in Genesis 11. Secular history says he is that king, but it doesn't name him in chapter 11, so it could be someone who took over. Biblically speaking, it could be him or it could be someone who took over for him later. Okay? My opinion is it's him and that the history is right, but it's not Bible. Okay? But that kingdom of Babel of chapter 10, verse 10, 10 being the number of Gentiles, so the first Gentile kingdom, there you have it. In chapter 11, instead of multiplying and replenish the earth, they try to stay together. And the whole earth was of one language and one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, same place where Babel is. Same place where Nebuchadnezzar sets up the image. Same place that an image will be set up by the Antichrist. The land of Shinar keeps showing up. In Zechariah or Zephaniah, you have the storks bringing wickedness over to Shinar. And verse 3 says, and they said one to another, go to, let us. Notice it's not about God, it's about man. Let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. They don't want to spread out. And the Lord came down to see the tower, city in the towers, the Lord, children of men builded. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. And people say, see, they could have done anything. They could have built a rocket and fly through the sun. No, it doesn't say they can do anything they imagine. It says anything they imagined. All the things that they've thought about doing, they can do. Okay, the things that they imagine. So God confounds the language in verse 7, and the Lord scatters them in verse 8 upon the face of the whole earth, and he calls the name, therefore is the name of it called Babel. Now the reason I believe that this is Nimrod over it is because the beginning of his kingdom is Babel in 1010, and here, this is where it started to be called Babel. So, seems to me that if the beginning of his kingdom is Babel, and this is where the name started, that he is the king over it at this point. All right? And two other verses, Deuteronomy 32, I mentioned in the last hour that he divided it into 12. A new heavens, new earth, New Jerusalem has 12 gates. The nations are going to enter into it. Nations that enter into the kingdom, they get through the tribulation and treat Israel well, so they're sheep nations. But in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, God refers back to this time. Verse 7. Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask thy father, and he will show thee, thy elders, and they will tell thee. What? When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance. Tower of Babel. When he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. How many are there? 12 children of Israel. One more verse. Why did he do that? Acts 17. So, after the flood, God says, go ahead and replenish the earth. Man says, we don't want to be scattered. We want to stay together. God spreads them out, scatters them upon the face of the whole earth. Unless they get back together, he changes their languages, and he sets up boundaries. And next week we'll see, I believe this is not only did he divide the nations, this is when he divided the land. Question? Oh. That he divided the land at this point in it to its current form. We'll look at that next week. But in Acts 17, verse 26, he's referring back to this time, and it says, and hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth. And then he quotes what we just read, and hath determined the times before appointed and their bounds of their habitation. So he put up boundaries so that they would stay in their separate nations, in their 12 nations, according to the number of the children of Israel. But here it gives the reason why, which in Deuteronomy, as far as I know, it did not. In verse 27 it says, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. So God divided them up because when man's united, they're more likely to deify man. Let us build a city, us a tower, us a name, instead of building God a name and so on, and obeying him. And so God said, I'll split them up because they're more likely to seek after me. So what do you find throughout history? When men are gathered together in large quantities, they seek after God less. That's why one reason of several, but one of the main reasons why cities tend to be more wicked than rural places. Why spiritual people are more likely to be found in rural places than in urban centers, okay? Because when man is united, they tend to exalt man. And so God spread them out for their own benefit, once again. And we'll look at that next week a little bit, why when man's united, the only time God unites man is to wipe him out. So you don't, the United Nations talks about the General Assembly and the United Nations. We'll look at a couple verses next week. When the nations are assembled and when they're united, it's because God's about to destroy them. So from the Tower of Babel to today, what has man's goal been always? One world, one card, one world church, one world government, one world everything. Why? Break down the boundaries. And there's always some good things that come out of that, which is why how they can get people to go along with it. There's always good things that come out of it. But in the end, it's not doing it God's way, and so it fails. All right, any questions? Sir?
That's next week.
We do not, because I did not bring in a review. So next week I'll bring in 2 reviews. One is a quiz for the following week, and then one for the exam the week after that. I want to try to do it where there's only one quiz or exam each time. So it'll be written out next week. You'll have a copy of that, and then the following week we'll look at that. I know on the schedule it says that I'm adjusting that a little bit, hopefully to make it more user-friendly for everybody here. All right.